Interlude 1. Aburame Shirou. He woke up to the feeling of his whole body throbbing with a bone-deep pain, even through the lingering numbness of the drugs. It felt like cords of barbed wire had been wrapped around his bones, before being tied into knots inside his chest. His every movement driving points deeper or making something catch and pull. Even breathing was an effort. Fuck, he thought, immediately realizing what had happened. I hate hospitals. It had been a while since he'd been hurt badly enough to need one, and, as tended to be the case, he hadn't been prepared for it, so his defenses had still been up. Experienced Aburame could train their Kakaichi to consume poisons affecting their host, and he, like most with that ability, kept it on at all times. Poison was one of those things, after all, where being immune to the ones you were aware of just wasn't good enough to keep you safe. And that choice had saved his life 43 times. But the Kakaichu couldn't distinguish between the intentions behind a poisoning, or tell if it was good or bad. So whatever he'd been given, his bugs had sucked it right out of his system, which meant he was feeling almost all of this. He couldn't feel his right arm. His left leg was there, but it felt like it had been crumpled up in some giant fist, so horrendously broken it barely had a shape anymore. He had a neck brace on, though it might have just been from the whiplash of the hit, and when he managed to open his eyes, the vision in the left one was so blurry he could barely make out shapes with it. About 4 dozen minor cuts and bruises, but surprisingly nothing went too deep. But there were fractures all throughout his ribs, hairline, but so numerous it was surprising the whole thing hadn't collapsed. And that was after treatment? He was shocked he was even alive. But beneath that, there was a strange, familiar pain. Something was gnawing at him, in a very literal sense. Gnawing on the inside. It had been a long time since the swarm had felt the need to expand their hive, to open up new tunnels or widening existing ones. But there it was. That familiar sensation, the feeling of mandibles excavating his skin. There was a reason that Aburame's Kakaichu technique needed to be learned so young. It took time for both the swarm and their hosts to get used to each other, both physically and in terms of chakra. The Kakaichu's nest was meant to grow in size slowly as the user aged, out of simple necessity, because if you tried to make an adult host a full swarm, odds were they just died trying. Not even necessarily from anything specific, although there were countless things that could go wrong. But after a certain point, it wasn't uncommon for people to just go into shock as bugs ate hollow spaces all throughout their bodies. But if that process occurred slowly, over years or decades, that was another story. The Aburame and the swarm were meant to grow alongside each other, adapting to each other and then to any threats they faced. The Aburame gave the Kakaichu home and food. The Kakaichu protected and served the Aburame. And while the Aburame grew old, the swarm didn't. It simply renewed and replaced itself, each generation stronger for the trials and experiences of their host. And then, when a clan member died, ideally, hopefully, their Kakaichu would return to the clan in turn. For the Aburame, it was a kind of immortality, their legacy, carried on by future generations, guarding their children, and their children's children. It was a subtle thing, so subtle that even as their host it had taken him 40 years to first feel it. But since then, inside of himself, he'd always felt the slightest traces of the chakra of those who came before. Here, his grandfather and grandmother, there an older cousin, the last remnant of several of his brothers, carried on after their deaths, and the only positive reminder he had of his father. So then, why was it that inside of him, today, he could feel only red? Why was it that the Kakaichu, meant to protect their host, were burrowing and digging still, with his body in such a condition? It wasn't odd necessarily for the Gekaichu to expand their tunnel network after a section of the hive was lost, such as through amputation, but that was usually months after the fact. Normally, they knew better than to do that while their host was injured. Despite their name, the Gekaichu were symbiotes more than parasites, at least once they were properly acclimated to a host, and they were generally careful with their home and food source. And yet, here they were, digging. And not just that, but the draw on his chakra, normally so slight and familiar that he barely noticed, was suddenly a burden on him while he was in a state where the Gekaichu would normally have been conservative with their feeding. What was going on? Stop, he thought, and that thought spread through his chakra to those that fed upon it, an intention shared amongst the hive. But they didn't listen. It had been over half a century since his Gekaichu had disobeyed him. Stop, he thought more forcefully, adjusting the flow of his chakra to emphasize the command. His nest was consuming easily 5 times the chakra they normally did, and he had to double that to get the message through, and if he hadn't already been laying in bed, the effort would have made him sag. But at the command, the swarm stopped. Completely. They didn't slow down or shift to other tasks. They went completely and utterly still within him. Even during moments of rest, he was used to the feeling of countless tiny legs moving inside him, of shells brushing against the inside of his body, of the buzz of wings. Here, now, that was gone, and his bugs were still as the grave. For the first time in maybe his entire life, the only thing Shirou felt inside of himself was his heartbeat. He didn't move, couldn't move, but hairs raced along his remaining arm and the back of his neck. He hated to admit it, but more than even the state his body was in, that had him spooked. The only motionless hive was a dead hive, and yet here his was, silent and still. It was frightening and worse, distracting. But not so distracting that he didn't still realize he wasn't alone. He couldn't move his neck much with the brace, but when he shifted his gaze downwards, he could just barely make out a shadowed figure sitting beside his bed. Even then, though, he recognized it. Fuck me, he thought. The day's full of shitty surprises. I thought you'd wake up soon, the third Hokage said. Shirou let his attention drift. With his good eye, he could see the sky through the window beside him, and the fading daylight told him at least half a day had passed. Over the forests outside the village, the clouds were piling up like mountains in the sky, and darkening as if they were stockpiling thunder and lightning. It's always nice, in a bitter sort of way, when nature was kind enough to make it clear he was about to have a shit fucking day. He couldn't even blame his inattention on the drugs, since they were already gone from his system. He just didn't want to be here. If you'd fucked up badly enough to find yourself in the hospital, and the Hokage still wanted to talk to you, it never meant anything good. That was the privilege of the truly elite screw-ups. Hokage-sama, he managed to bring himself to say anyway, and managed to stamp down his reaction to just a slow, pained exhale afterwards. Whatever had happened, he wouldn't cry and whimper in front of the Hokage. My apologies, Edison said anyway. I'd hoped to spare you the pain, so he attempted to pacify and remove your Gekaichu temporarily, but they ate their way out of their enclosure and devoured the bugs sent to restrain them. They didn't seem to respond well to others' attempts to control them either. After several incidents, we decided it was best to just work around them. The fuck did that mean? Shirou thought, but didn't ask. Instead, he took several slow breaths. They hurt. A lot. He decided to skip the pleasantries too, for his own sake. Years of experience told him that he only had so many questions in him before the pain made him pass out, and if he went through the whole loyal vassal song and dance, he might black out part of the way through. He had to be careful with his words, selective with his questions, and while under any other circumstances, The sheer level of what the hell going on with his Gekaishi would have taken precedence over nearly all else. Today, it might not even make the list. Is Shibi alright? He managed. He saw motion. After a few seconds, he realized the Hokage was fiddling with his pipe. It wasn't lit, presumably because they were in the hospital, but the leader of the village clearly considered that cause for regret, which set Shirou immediately on edge. Shibi is fine, Hiruzen assured him, despite his fears. What do you remember? A dangerous question, if an easy one to remember. Because what did he mean by that? Unless he'd been hurt worse than he thought. The Hokage had been there when he went down. Nothing after I got hit. He rasped and then frowned, because that wasn't quite true. Woke up screaming at one point? The Hokage turned his eyes to an empty chair nearby. It was closer to him, so Shirou could get a slightly better look at it. He recognized his granddaughter's gift at once. Frayed in places, banged up, dirtied, and stained, but whole. Arguably more whole than he was. It's probably saved your life, Hiruzen mused. None of the shrapnel or debris penetrated it, at least. But it was an effort getting you out of it. We tried to cut through it, but we couldn't without risking your life even further. Remarkable Clotho. I wanted to discuss it with you, but perhaps at a better time. Despite his words, saying nothing about where he'd gotten some kind of magical super cloth seemed incredibly unwise. So Shirou decided to extend an olive branch. It'd be easy enough to prove and also misdirect later, after all. Spider silk. A recent thing. He grunted and left it at that. This isn't an interrogation, Shirou. You're a hero. The Hokage said without looking at him, eyes focused on his pipe. Huh? In that moment he noticed something. On the blurred side of his vision there was an odd shape, a large lumpy mess of colors. He risked moving his neck just enough to glimpse it with his other eye, and only then did he realize what it was. Presents. Boxes, flowers, gifts, and letters were piled up so high on the table beside his bed that he could have mistaken it for a looming figure. Huh? He thought again, even more confused. The Hokage still wasn't looking at him, turning slightly away, as if to avoid seeing his face. It was quite a feat of improvisation, using your Gekaichu to absorb the Kyuubi's chakra and redistribute it amongst Konoha's forces, the Hokage said. But thanks to your heroism and the strength you gave Konoha's forces, we were able to hold the line until the fourth arrived, to say nothing of your efforts to find and protect the wounded. If not for you, hundreds of shinobi would have died, and even more civilians. The hell is he talking about? Shirou wondered. Indeed. I don't think there's any who saw your golden barrier protecting the village who will soon forget the sight. The Hokage praised, still without looking at him. Golden? A thought occurred, but it was so ridiculous he dismissed it immediately. He tried to dismiss it, rather, and yet somehow the thought lingered. Then, slowly, it consolidated, forming a cold, heavy mass that seemed to weigh down his gut. Oh? He asked carefully. The Aburame were somewhat infamously inscrutable. Amari, his love, had even teased him for looking impassive on his wedding day, though he's made up for it after. Here, though, in this moment, he hoped nothing showed on his face, because he found himself struggling, even though he wasn't sure what he was trying not to show. There were some who wondered if keeping such a technique secret was a sign of treachery, the Hokage admitted, and by some he probably meant Danzo. But I silenced such complaints. I told him that the village's time of need is precisely the time to reveal such secrets, and that if we answer efforts to protect the village with accusations, all we do is disincline further attempts to do so. However, since the majority of the village's active shinobi were directly exposed to the Kyuubi's chakra by the technique, there was a secondary request for an investigation into the technique's safety and any potential side effects. And that, at least, was a fair request. While no one seemed to be directly harmed, we all saw what the Kyuubi's chakra could do, and while needs must in the moment, assurances were requested that no one's skin would slouch off in the coming weeks. Oh? Shirou asked again, legitimately struggling to think of something, anything to say, while also trying not to tense. That last part, thankfully, was easy. One of the few upsides it turned out of having a body so thoroughly broken, it wasn't necessarily very responsive. Given it pertained to clan secrets, I took it upon myself to head the investigation. No one complained, of course, because after all, why would I need help determining the nature of a new jutsu? Asked the man they called the Professor. I quickly determined that it would have minimal side effects for any recipients. Given the nature of the Kyuubi's chakra, such limited side effects are a testament to the user's skill in handling chakra, or else their recklessness. As the chakra was precisely adapted to match that of every shinobi it was gifted to, the consequences should be limited to that of a particularly strenuous fight. Still, handling that much chakra so well, amidst a combat situation no less, is quite difficult. I thought that, most likely, the user would have to take that chakra into themselves first, and then reshape it. Shirou began before stopping himself. What was he even supposed to say? Is my less than a year old psychic super genius baby granddaughter okay, after sucking up and redistributing the demon fox's flesh-melting chakra? The old shinobi saying goes, an interrogation is just like a confession. Even if everyone involved knows, some things aren't real until you say them out loud. And fuck it all, but he didn't want this to be real. He didn't want any of this to be real. Yes, he said instead, shifting his gaze straight up towards the ceiling. The shape transformation used marks it clearly as an Aburame technique. The Hokage continued, and his voice threaded a line between explaining and dictating with familiar ease. Most of those inside the dome did not notice, but the technique bears clear similarities to those of the first Tsuchikage, which also explains the Aburame clan's reluctance to use it. Correct, Shirou accepted. It was as decent an explanation as any. While the family relation to the enemy village was tenuous at best, the first Tsuchikage being his great-aunt's son after marrying into another clan, it had been used against the Aburame clan politically more than once to extract efforts and favors they might not otherwise have given. If he had given their clan any techniques, Shirou probably would have been reluctant to use them due to the implication. However, several shinobi running support noticed that there appeared to be a small trail extending away from the dome, and one verified that it led towards the Aburame compound. Word of this spread during the aftermath of the battle, while the chaos was still unfolding. The Hokage continued, he didn't name any names, which Shirou supposed was probably for the best. He didn't know what the village's political situation looked like right now, but it probably wouldn't help his family if he got himself a murder charge the minute he left the hospital. I investigated this myself as well, and found that the trail led underground at an acute angle, though it was thankfully easy to determine where it ended up. The influence of the Kyuubi's chakra melted much of the intervening earth, it would seem. Of course it fucking did. Fuck. It seems the trail led into the tunnels under the Aburame compound. The Hokage continued, specifically into the rooms where the clan stores some of its rarest insects. My speculation was that this experimental jutsu was performed with the aid of a new breed of Gekaichu, who assisted in processing and attuning the Kyuubi's dangerous chakra. However, between the urgency of the technique and the destructiveness of the Kyuubi's chakra, the damage to this breed was extensive. Indeed, much of the containment cell was destroyed in the process. The room it had led to wouldn't have been one of the clan's containment rooms, and the Hokage would probably have known that even without checking. It would have been close to them though, since the second most heavily protected area in the tunnels was right next to the first, close enough that it probably could have passed as true from the outside to anyone else. If the evidence on the inside had been destroyed, Shibi might have done something that reckless to protect his wife and child, but such efforts wouldn't have worked against the head of the village, and he'd have known that. No, most likely the Hokage had concealed the matter himself. How extensive was the damage? Shirou asked carefully, forcing out a whole sentence. Structurally, relatively minor. The room and 4 of those around it collapsed, but Shibi was able to evacuate everything important before the tunnels gave way. However, it seems there was one unintended side effect. It would appear that the swarm's proximity to your granddaughter caused an unexpected and unfortunate reaction. My assumption is that her immature Kakaichu instinctively tried to absorb the immense source of chakra they sensed nearby, with terrible results. Would you disagree? Oh, gods and devils, what does that mean? Shirou wondered. How the hell can I agree or disagree if you don't tell me what happened? But this wasn't the briefing. They were getting their story straight. This was for his clan's sake. He made himself remember that. No, Shirou said. The Hokage still didn't look at him. Your chakra signature has changed, as has your granddaughter's, he stated. A curious phenomenon, but perhaps unsurprising, due to the amount of chakra the technique manipulated. I believe that any oddities that were sensed during the attack to be a byproduct thereof. Yes, Shirou managed. As for the jutsu itself, while it proved safe for the recipients, due to the risks for the user, we've decided to classify it tentatively as a hidden and forbidden jutsu, heavily restricting who's allowed access to any details regarding it. The Hokage continued. It was another offering. Shirou understood and grunted in an affirmative. Do you have a name for official records? Fuck. No. He prided himself on naming jutsu normally, ever since he'd first made Tamari laugh. But he couldn't think of a damn thing right now. His mind was empty but for horrible possibilities. No. Then let us tentatively name it Hyaki Yagyo, Hiruzen said. The first Tsuchikage favored such stories for his jutsu, as I recall. The Night Parade of 100 Demons. An old story. They said it was supposed to be led by the yokai Nurarihyon, but at the moment he was more inclined to think his granddaughter was an Amano-yaku, the way she seemed to do the exact opposite of whatever was asked of her. Fuck, he thought, as the pain continued to hammer him. There was a pulsating headache brewing at his temples, and it was spreading by the moment. Fuck the story and the subterfuge. My granddaughter, he began, perhaps a touch too forcefully, because he immediately had to stop and take very slow breaths to keep from choking on the words. Okay? At last, Hiruzen met his eyes. It's the responsibility of shinobi to protect the village, and it's the responsibility of the Hokage to protect those shinobi in turn, he said, his voice firm, but his face so old. As soon as we identified your daughter-in-law trying to carry her through the ruined streets, she was escorted to the hospital to be given treatment. Shirou waited, mouth dry. She's stable, Hiruzen said, but Shirou still didn't relax, meeting his eyes. After 54 hours, she appears to have stabilized. The medical didn't believe she's over the worst of it now, but she's being monitored constantly. As for your daughter-in-law... Himari? He asked. What happened? The Hokage hesitated. A classic sign of a shit day about to turn worse. "She's gone into labor," he said. "We believe it's because of the stress of the attack and..." He didn't finish, but Shirou's blood still ran cold. He realized he was breathing harder when the pain made black spots flicker across his vision. But labor? Himari couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 months along. The odds! "Biwako," Shirou said before he even thought it through. The Hokage went still. "Hiruzen, please." With Tsunade gone, the third's wife was the best medic in the village. The third's wife, Biwako, had been the one to first teach Tsunade the medical arts, and while the student had surpassed the master, she was no slouch herself. She had retired from even hospital duty some years ago, but was still known to insist in times of need. And she was his granddaughter's and his grandson's greatest hope. But when he met the Hokage's eyes again, all he saw in them was pain. Hiruzen looked like he was barely holding on to the image of the Hokage. "No," Shirou breathed. "Biwako is dead," he said. "She was assassinated." Fuck. Shirou thought again. Fuck it all. In a distant sort of way, he knew that would have consequences for the entire village. Even after the first and second had died, Konoha had managed to maintain its position of prominence through 3 shinobi world wars, and there was no one reason for that. Rather, it was a combination of things. The Yamanaka's invaluable skill when it came to interrogation, the Sharingan and Byakugan's ocular powers, several clans with incredible tracking ability, and some very powerful shinobi all contributed. But a big one, however subtle, was that for 3 generations, Konoha had possessed the best medical ninkorps on the continent. Konoha's hospitals could put shinobi back on their feet from injuries that any other village would send people straight to the morgue for. Back in the Second War, at their height, talk between shinobi was that as long as you didn't get a vital organ removed, you'd probably be fine. If you lose a limb, just make sure to collect it afterwards. Even after Tsunade had left the village, their medical corps had degraded from the best on the continent in a miraculous... Sometimes the Slug Princess just pops people's limbs back on and sends them back to the battlefield way, to still the best, but in a mundane, best trained, best equipped and largest sort of way, under the reign of Biwako. If Tsunade had been here, a 4 or 5 months premature birth might have been only of mild concern. If Biwako had been alive, it would have been riskier, scarier, but he would have had faith that they both had good odds of making it through. Now, a pit had opened up in Shirou's stomach. "Who?" he bit out. "Who dared join the attack?" "According to what you said during the battle, it was the work of a masked man." Hiruzen said in a voice so despondent it nearly hid the simmering rage beneath it. "Whomever they were, they appear to have been able to fight the fourth long enough to delay him. Under the circumstances, I'm left to believe they were the perpetrator of the attack as well. I understand if you're having trouble remembering such things now, but when you're able, I would appreciate it if you could remember more details as quickly as possible and compose a report." Shirou was furious, but even that was secondary to the cold fear that was fighting to take hold of it. "Shibi?" he asked again. "Your son is with his wife and daughter," Hiruzen said. "He was making rounds between the 3 of you, but since you seem likely to wake soon, I asked to speak to you first. I have already made him aware of my findings, and as a leading expert in your absence, he agreed with my assertions." Shirou closed his eyes for a moment, then nearly passed out. But that was... good. The Hokage stood then and waited for a while, silent. "I'll tell him you're awake," he said at last, and then... "I'm sorry, Shirou. I've done what I could. I wish I could do more." And then he left, and Shirou was alone with his thoughts. Damn it, he breathed, and wished he was well enough to stand, to walk, to know and see instead of wonder. Desperate, he reached out for his Gekaichu again. Please, he thought, but they didn't answer. He pushed harder. Please, just one. Be my eyes. Please, I beg you. Slowly, one crawled free, into his line of sight, onto the fingers of his good arm. The first thing that caught his eye was the color. The Gekaichu's normal black having been dyed a pure and gleaming gold. Less suited for subtle work, but beggars can't be choosers. Working slowly, carefully, he tried to urge it to take flight, to carry with it his chakra and spirit, and bring back to him what it saw. Some sign, at the very least, that his family might be okay. Instead, it did something else. Gold turning to red like it was rusting before his eyes, and it changed. It was hard to describe how or into what, because it was in motion, but there were wings, stingers, tails, pincers, mandibles, and a feeling of burning, all in motion, perhaps around a hard-to-see central body, or maybe the same parts were just shifting in purpose and shape. It hissed and chirped. It made strange sounds with the brushing of its limb parts. Then it bit him. More than once, though some might have been pincers instead. Left with little choice, before it could sting him, he crushed it with a thumb, and it was harder than it should have been, even discounting his injuries. But at least then, the motion stopped, but for the post-mortem twitching of several limbs. Until the crunching shell uncrunched, popping back out into place. Spilled guts unspilled, and the bug twitching and shuddering, before crawling back inside of him, like nothing had happened. It still didn't obey his will, leaving him alone with his thoughts and fears as a distant storm rolled in. Fuck. Tora, he thought. Why? His granddaughter, the genius. His granddaughter, who may as well have saved the village, or at least countless lives therein, and it had nearly cost her her life. If this had happened to his Gekaichu, what had happened to hers, at the center of it all? What had happened to her body, that she had spent over 2 days on the table, and was still being monitored? What if... In the end, no matter how smart she may have been, she was still a child. What would she do if she found out what had happened to her mother, her brother? What would she think and feel? Gods, he thought. Please don't do this to my family. At last, it started to rain. And when he looked towards the window to watch it, something caught his eye. Atop the silk cloth Taura had given him lay the wax mask she'd gifted him as well, or so he suspected. Because before, the mask had been a rough, almost worn-looking grey face mask, but now it had the appearance of polished, lacquered red wood. It leered at him with a twisted expression, Oni-like and almost laughing, as if amused by some joke, or his situation. The eyes were solid yellow and somehow bug-like, matching the vague image of mandibles around a mouth that leered and grinned at him. For a blind, furious moment he wanted to throw it out the window, but he couldn't do that either. And so here he was, left with nothing but his thoughts, a horde of disobedient nightmare insects, and a laughing bug demon mask. Damn it all, he thought as he finally let the beating pain take him under. Amari, why am I still so helpless?